Story number 1. The Whispering Shore. The team had been on the search for days, combing through the dense jungle, their boots sinking into the rich soil of the uncharted island. Dr. Claire Williamson, a seasoned archaeologist, led the way, her eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of the ancient civilization she hoped to uncover. The island was lush and untouched, the air thick with the scent of salt and earth, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore was the only constant. At first glance, it seemed like any other tropical paradise. Towering trees with glossy leaves formed a canopy above them, and vibrant flowers bloomed in unexpected bursts of color. But there was something about the place, something that made Claire uneasy, like the island itself was holding its breath, waiting. "Are we sure this place has never been discovered before?" her colleague, Martin, asked as he swept his hand across a strange stone formation half buried in the sand. Claire nodded, though her certainty was waning. "We've double-checked the coordinates. This island doesn't appear on any maps." As they began to excavate, strange markings appeared on the rocks and trees surrounding them. Curved symbols and jagged lines, intricately carved into the bark and stone as if something, or someone, had been trying to communicate with the land itself. The symbols were unlike anything they had ever seen before, something older, deeper, and darker. The first whisper came just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was faint, barely audible, like the wind playing tricks on them. But as the team gathered around the fire that night, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. At first, they thought it was just the wind through the trees, but the sound was different. It wasn't the wind at all. It was a voice, low, guttural, and urgent. "Did you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice trembling slightly. Martin, who had been staring at the edge of the forest, nodded slowly. "It's not the wind, it's something else." The team stood in silence, straining their ears, the whispers now unmistakably coming from the dense thicket just beyond the clearing where they had set up camp. The sound seemed to rise and fall like a chant, as if the island itself was calling them deeper into its heart. As the days passed, the whispers grew bolder, more insistent, and the air around them grew heavier, thick with a sense of dread. The archaeologists continued their work, driven by the thrill of discovery, but with each new find, the island seemed to respond, the whispers growing louder, the symbols more intricate and terrifying. It was Claire who first found the altar, half hidden beneath vines and moss, a massive stone structure that seemed to pulse with a sickly energy. Carved into the stone were more of the strange symbols, their shapes almost alive, shifting in the dim light. At the center of the altar was a darkened stone basin, crusted with ancient dried blood. Martin knelt next to it, running his fingers along the surface. This doesn't feel like a normal sight," he muttered. "It feels wrong, like we're not supposed to be here." The whispers grew louder that night, clearer and more urgent, now accompanied by a low, rhythmic thrum, like the beating of a heart. It seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath them, vibrating in their bones. The team was on edge, their nerves stretched thin, and it wasn't long before they realized they were not alone. As the moon rose high in the sky, the whispers became a chant. The voices weren't just speaking anymore, they were singing, calling out in an ancient tongue that no one could understand. But it didn't matter. The words were enough. They felt the island stir, the earth beneath their feet shifting, as if something was awakening, something long buried, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The realization hit Claire like a punch to the gut. The island wasn't just alive, it was watching them, waiting for them. The ritual that had been set in motion was one of blood and sacrifice, a calling from the past that demanded something in return. And as the whispers grew louder, it became clear that the island's hunger was insatiable. The last thing Claire saw before the world went black was the figure standing in the shadows, its face hidden behind a mask of bone and ash. The whispers were no longer a distant sound. They were all around her, inside her, drowning out everything else. She felt the weight of the island's anger, its ancient power, and realized that the price of their discovery had been paid. They had woken something terrible, something that had been waiting on the Whispering Shore for centuries. And now it was awake. The next morning, the island was silent. The archaeologists were gone, their camp abandoned, their tools scattered across the sand like forgotten toys. The whispers, however, had not stopped. They lingered in the wind, carried across the water, and etched into the very stones of the island, forever waiting, forever calling. Story number 2. The Forgotten Village. The island appeared out of nowhere. One minute, it was just a speck on the horizon, barely visible through the morning mist. Then, as they drew closer, it seemed to loom out of the fog, an unsettling silhouette against the gray sky. A group of tourists, eager for an adventure, had boarded the small boat, curious about the old stories they'd heard, the rumors of a lost village on a forgotten island. They docked on the rocky shore, the boat creaking as it rocked gently with the tide. The island looked like any other, covered in thick forest, the salty wind cutting through the trees. But there was something strange about it, an eerie quiet that seemed to hang in the air, as if the island itself was holding its breath. "This place is a ghost town," said Nick, the group's leader. He was the one who'd organized the trip, the one who loved to find off-the-beaten-path destinations. He was grinning, but there was a hint of unease in his voice. The village they found seemed frozen in time. The houses were perfectly preserved, not a single shingle out of place, no cracks in the walls. But there was no one there. No signs of life, no animals, no birds, no voices. It felt like a set for a movie, a stage where everything looked real but lacked any kind of soul. The tourists walked through the village, their footsteps muffled on the well-kept cobblestone streets. The buildings were strange, too uniform, as if they had all been built by the same hand, with the same cold precision. The windows were dark, the doors solid, but no light came from within. It was as if the entire village had been abandoned long ago, yet left perfectly intact. "This is way too weird," Anna, one of the tourists, said as she stepped closer to one of the houses. Her voice wavered, as if the chill of the place was creeping into her bones. "Who lives here?" The others shrugged, but there was no answer to be found. The village felt wrong, like it was waiting for something. As they wandered deeper into the heart of the village, the first strange thing happened. They heard footsteps. At first, they thought it was one of them, someone walking behind. But when they stopped, the footsteps didn't. They were out of sync, echoing across the empty streets, as though someone, or something, was following them. "Did you hear that?" Rachel asked, her face pale. "It's nothing," Nick said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent. The tourists turned, but no one was there. Just the empty, silent village. Then came the shadows. It started small, just a flicker at the edge of their vision. But soon, they began to see them more clearly. Shadows that didn't belong. They were dark, moving against the light, stretching in ways they shouldn't, slipping around corners, never quite matching the shapes of the people they followed. "Something's not right," said Ben, the quietest of the group. He was staring at the shadows with wide, fearful eyes. The more they explored, the worse it became. The air grew heavier, thick with a palpable sense of dread. The temperature seemed to drop, and the wind began to howl, though there was no sign of a storm. Every corner they turned, every house they approached, felt like a trap closing in around them. They finally found it, a crumbling stone structure at the center of the village. It was different from the other buildings, larger, older, and completely covered in strange, faded symbols that seemed to pulse with an energy all their own. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. Inside, they found old rotting books, dried flowers, and remnants of something that once had been alive. But the most disturbing thing was the altar. It sat at the center of the room, a stone slab covered in scratches, with what looked like dried bloodstains. Around the altar, the symbols were carved deep into the walls, forming a circle. That was when they realized the truth. The village wasn't just abandoned, it was a prison. It wasn't just empty, it was full of something far worse. The villagers hadn't left, they couldn't leave. Not after what they had done. As they pieced together the grim history of the place, they learned of an ancient cult that had used the island to summon something dark, something terrible, something that had bound the souls of the villagers to the land. The island was a cage, the village its prison, and the cursed souls of those who had lived there were trapped, unable to escape the nightmare they had awakened. The whispers began then, low, guttural murmurs, echoing through the stone walls of the altar room. The air grew thick with a presence, and the shadows in the corners shifted, stretching toward them. The tourists tried to leave, but the island wouldn't let them. The path back to the boat was gone, replaced by more houses, more streets that didn't lead anywhere. The village had grown, the land itself shifting and bending, as if it were alive, feeding on their fear. By the time the sun set, the tourists were gone, their voices lost to the island. The village remained, silent and still, waiting for the next lost soul to stumble upon it. And the shadows, the footsteps, and the whispers continued, ever present, as the curse of the forgotten village endured, forever trapped in the grip of an ancient evil. Story number 3. The depths below. David had never thought he'd end up like this. Stranded on an island, the remnants of his shipwrecked vessel drifting out of sight beyond the waves. The sea had swallowed everything, leaving only a piece of driftwood for him to cling to, the taste of salt in his mouth and a burning thirst in his throat. When he washed up on the shore, there was no immediate sense of relief. The island was eerily quiet, save for the occasional call of unseen birds in the distance. His body ached, his skin raw from the salt water, but there was something else gnawing at him. Something more primal, deeper than his exhaustion. The island looked empty, but that didn't mean it felt empty. The air had a weight to it, dense and thick, like it was holding its breath. As David stumbled inland, searching for food or shelter, he could feel it. A presence, like the island was watching him, waiting for something. He found a small stream of fresh water after hours of searching, and he drank greedily, feeling the coolness slide down his throat. His eyes swept across the surroundings, the overgrown jungle pressing in around him, a tangle of vines and thick foliage. But it wasn't just the jungle. It was the ground beneath him. The very earth seemed alive, as if it had a pulse, a rhythm that was wrong, unnatural. The sounds of the island weren't just birds and wind. They were different, like whispers in the distance, echoes that carried through the trees, unsettling in their persistence. As night fell, the feeling of being watched became almost unbearable. David tried to sleep, huddled in a small makeshift shelter he'd fashioned from branches, but the strange noises persisted. The air hummed faintly, vibrating with a low, almost imperceptible growl, like something deep beneath the earth was stirring. The next day, driven by a mix of curiosity and the urge to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening, David began to explore further. His journey led him toward the center of the island, where a series of jagged cliffs rose out of the earth. It was there that he stumbled upon the entrance to what looked like a cave. The opening was hidden by thick undergrowth, almost as if the island itself was trying to keep it concealed. But it was too late. David was already drawn to it, unable to resist the pull. Inside, the air was colder, the light dimmer. He carefully stepped over rocks and uneven terrain, the ground slick with moisture. As he ventured deeper into the cavern, his eyes began to adjust to the darkness. And that's when he saw them. Fragments of stone, broken pillars, and strange carvings on the walls, depicting figures that looked both human and something else, something older. The deeper he went, the more he understood. This was not just a natural cave. It was a tomb, a temple, a place where something ancient and powerful had once been worshipped. But there was more. A sudden sound, a crack, echoed from somewhere deep within the cavern. David froze. The humming sound he had felt before grew louder, now unmistakable, vibrating the walls, the very ground beneath him. It was like the island itself was alive, and it was angry. He turned, eyes wide, heart pounding. The air around him grew thick, heavy, charged with an electric energy that he could feel on his skin. And then there was a movement, a flicker of something in the shadows, too fast to catch with his eyes. His breath caught in his throat. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and David stumbled backward, his hands searching for purchase against the slick stone. A voice, a low, guttural whisper, slithered through the cavern, filling his mind with an unrelenting dread. It wasn't in any language he understood. It didn't need to be. The meaning was clear, the message unmistakable. You should never have come. The tremors grew stronger, and David's fear intensified. He spun around, trying to make his way back toward the cave entrance, but the path had changed. The walls of the cavern seemed to shift, blocking his way. He was trapped. His pulse raced, panic setting in as the echoes of that voice grew louder, more insistent. The presence, whatever it was, had been waiting, watching, and now it was awake. With a final surge of adrenaline, David pushed forward, sprinting through the dark, the walls narrowing around him like a living thing. He stumbled toward the entrance, but as he neared it, he realized with a sickening certainty that he wasn't the only one trying to escape. The shadows in the cavern twisted, coiling around him, reaching for him, hungry for the next soul to claim. David ran faster, his legs burning, his breath ragged. As he burst from the cave into the daylight, he thought he saw something dark and massive, lurking just beyond the tree line. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The island was alive, and it was closing in on him. He reached the shore, stumbling toward the water, but there was no sign of the shipwrecked debris. The ocean was vast and empty, an endless stretch of blue. And behind him, the island was silent once more, its pulse gone quiet, waiting for the next soul to wash ashore. David sank to his knees, the weight of his situation pressing down on him. He was alone, but he couldn't escape. He had uncovered something ancient, and now the island would never let him go. The depths below had claimed him, and it was hungry. Story number 4. The Island of Lost Time. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. A week on a private island, away from the chaos of life, where the only thing to do was relax, swim, and enjoy each other's company. The kind of vacation they had all dreamed of. A secluded paradise far from the world's worries. But from the moment they arrived, things started to feel wrong. The first oddity was the sun. It never moved. It hung high in the sky, as bright and unyielding as it had been when they first set foot on the island, and it never seemed to get any closer to the horizon. No matter what time of day they thought it was, it always felt like midday. There was no dusk, no nightfall, just the same blinding light that refused to fade. At first, the friends laughed it off. "Must be some kind of weird optical illusion," Mark said, shaking his head. "Probably just the way the island is angled or something." But then, there were the tides. The beach had no ebb and flow. The water didn't move. It just lapped at the shore in the same way it had when they first arrived, unmoving, as if it were frozen in time. "Weird, right?" Claire asked, eyeing the still water suspiciously. She stepped into the shallow waves, but they didn't pull back, didn't rise higher. It felt as though the ocean was holding its breath. The group tried to enjoy the island, still determined to make the best of it. They explored the dense jungle, swam in the strange, still waters, and tried to laugh off the growing sense of unease that clung to them like a second skin. But as the days stretched on, something began to shift, something they couldn't ignore. The dreams started that night. Claire woke up first, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. She couldn't remember much about the dream, only flashes. Images of a crumbling village, strange figures in the shadows, and a deep, resonating voice that whispered her name. When she went to the others to tell them, she found they had all had the same dream. Each of them had seen the same figures, heard the same whispers, but none of them could explain what it meant. The days became a blur. They couldn't tell if it was the second day or the 10th. It all felt the same. The sun never moved, the tides never changed, and the dreams only grew more vivid and disturbing. They began to see things. Hallucinations, they thought at first, but they were so real. Figures walking just beyond their vision, shadows that lurked in the corners of their rooms, whispers that followed them through the trees. One night, Mark and Claire ventured into the jungle together, drawn by an overwhelming compulsion to see what lay beyond the dense brush. They stumbled upon an old broken stone structure, half covered by vines. The walls were covered in faded symbols that felt familiar, yet alien. Mark reached out to touch one, and the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. The dream that night was different. This time, the figures in the shadows weren't just watching. They were speaking, urgently, almost pleading. The voice in Claire's dream was clearer now, repeating the same words over and over. "You must leave, or you'll never leave." They tried to leave. They packed their bags, hoping that maybe they had just imagined the whole thing. But when they reached the beach, the boat that had brought them there was gone. The water, once still, had begun to churn, but not in a natural way. It swirled as if something deep beneath the surface was stirring. The truth of the island began to reveal itself in fragments, strange whispers during their waking hours, flashes of images in the corner of their eyes, and the undeniable feeling that they were being drawn into something they couldn't escape. The dreams grew worse. The figures, pale, twisted things, started to follow them. They weren't just hallucinations anymore. They were there, standing just out of sight, always watching, always waiting. The whispers became voices, words that spoke in a language none of them could understand, but which somehow they all felt they should know. It was Rachel who finally uncovered the truth. Deep in the jungle, she found the remnants of a long-forgotten village, its foundations cracked and broken, the air heavy with the smell of rot. In the center of the village was a burial ground, long overgrown with weeds, and in the center of it all, an ancient stone slab, carved with the same symbols they had seen throughout the island. She realized what had happened. The island was built on cursed ground, a burial site for something old, something malevolent. The spirits of those who had been buried there had never rested, their souls bound to the island by a twisted force. And now it had trapped them, caught in a never-ending cycle of time. The island was out of time, a place where the past and present collided and looped into each other, where the days stretched endlessly, never allowing escape. "We're not meant to leave," Rachel whispered, her face pale. "We're trapped. We're part of it now." It was too late to escape. The island had already claimed them. The days repeated, one after the other, and no matter how hard they tried to break the loop, the sun never set, the tides never changed. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all consumed by the island's curse. The island of lost time would not let them go, and they would never leave. Story number 5. The Heart of the Island. Lena had come to the island to escape. Her life in the city had fallen apart. Relationships broken, friends lost, her own mind unraveling with guilt and regret. The isolation was what she needed, or so she told herself. The island was far away from everything. No people, no distractions, just the sounds of the ocean and the hum of the jungle. It was supposed to be a place of peace, a place for healing. But as soon as she arrived, something felt wrong. The island was beautiful, sure, with its tall palm trees swaying in the breeze and the soft, sandy beach. The air was thick with salt and warmth, and the sounds of the waves crashing against the shore were calming. Still, the moment she stepped onto the shore, a feeling of heaviness settled over her. Something she couldn't shake, something that followed her through the trees. She rented a small, rustic cabin near the beach, hoping to spend her days walking the shore and reading. The first few days passed in a blur of quiet. But then, one afternoon, she decided to venture deeper into the jungle. The path was narrow, overgrown with vines and dense underbrush, but Lena pushed forward. There was something compelling about the jungle, something that seemed to pull at her, as though it was calling her to come closer. She had heard whispers from the locals before she left, half-forgotten legends about the island, about a place deep in the jungle where no one dared to go. They spoke of a stone structure, ancient and mysterious, said to hold the island's very soul. Lena wasn't one to believe in myths, but the curiosity gnawed at her. She had to see it for herself. Hours passed, and she finally found it. A massive stone temple, crumbled with age yet still standing tall against the trees. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols she couldn't understand, and the air around the place was thick with an ancient energy. She walked inside, heart pounding with a mix of fear and fascination. It felt like the ground itself was alive, pulsing beneath her feet. The further she went into the structure, the stronger the sensation became, like something was watching her, something that wanted her here. In the center of the temple she found it, the heart. It was not an object as she had expected, but a living, beating entity. A massive, pulsating stone that seemed to throb with life. The surface of the stone rippled like water, its texture soft and warm to the touch. It was alive in a way that made her skin crawl, but she couldn't pull herself away. It drew her in like a magnet, as though it were reaching for her. As she stood there, her thoughts began to blur, and memories she had long buried rose to the surface. Painful memories of the loss, of the choices she'd made. It was like the heart was pulling her emotions to the surface, feeding on them, draining her of her strength. The air grew thick, suffocating, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She felt a sudden overwhelming sense of desperation, as though everything she had been running from had found her once again, and it was now clawing its way out. That's when the whispers began. They were faint at first, like distant voices carried on the wind, but soon they grew louder, clearer. They spoke to her in a language she couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear. The heart was speaking to her, feeding off her confusion, her sorrow, her fear. The more she listened, the more the words seeped into her mind, digging deeper, until she couldn't tell where her thoughts ended and the heart's began. It wanted something from her. It needed her. She staggered backward, shaking, but the stone pulsed in time with her heart, as if drawing her closer. The legends she had heard suddenly made sense. The heart was not just a part of the island, it was the island, the living force that controlled everything. It had been feeding off the emotions of those who visited, draining them, pulling them in to bring about its rebirth. Lena was the next step. The heart had chosen her. It had been waiting for her, feeding on her grief and loneliness, her pain, her fear. It had used her to return to life. The more she fought it, the stronger it became. The walls around her seemed to close in, the temple shifting and expanding like something organic. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and she could hear the sound of something huge, something ancient, stirring beneath the surface. The heart needed her emotions to survive, and it had been slowly feeding on her ever since she arrived, drawing on her sorrow, her guilt, her anger. The island had been waiting for someone like her, someone who would unravel the mystery and awaken the ancient force that had been trapped for centuries. Lena tried to run, but the jungle had changed. The trees closed in on her, the path twisting in impossible directions. She was trapped, the heart's presence suffocating her, pulling her back toward it, drawing her to the center where it could feed on her completely. And as she was pulled deeper into the jungle, the heart throbbed, louder and louder, its beat in sync with her pulse. She could feel her mind slipping, the last of her resistance fading as the island's will became her own. Lena had come to the island to escape, but the heart had never meant for her to leave, and now it would never let her go. Story number 6. The Eyes of the Island. Adam had always preferred the solitude of the lighthouse. It wasn't much, just a small weathered cabin and the towering structure perched on the edge of a jagged cliff, but it was all he needed. The island was far from the nearest town, isolated and untouched, and that was exactly how he liked it. His job as the lighthouse keeper gave him purpose, and the routine of lighting the beacon each evening and maintaining the equipment was enough to fill his days. But recently, something had begun to feel off. At first, it was subtle. A book on the shelf that he swore he hadn't left there. A small tool gone missing. Little things, easily explained away by the island's weather, by the isolation that could make anyone feel a bit unsettled. But the longer he stayed, the stranger things became. The movements, the cold spots in the air, the feeling that he wasn't alone in his cabin at night. It started one evening, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. Adam had finished his work for the day and was settling down for a quiet night with a meal and a book. As he sat in his chair, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There was a presence in the room, a feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. He looked around the small cabin, but there was no one there. His eyes flicked to the window, and for a split second, he thought he saw movement in the shadows outside. Shrugging it off, he returned to his book, but the feeling lingered. A faint whisper in the air, a rustle just beyond the cabin walls. He told himself it was the wind. The island was known for its fierce storms, after all. Later that night, as he prepared to sleep, he saw them. 2 glowing dots of yellow light in the darkness, hovering just outside the window. At first, he thought it was some trick of the moonlight, perhaps a reflection off the glass. But when he moved closer, he realized they were eyes, unblinking, unfeeling, staring into him from the blackness. Adam's heart pounded in his chest. He stepped back, trying to make sense of it, but when he looked again, the eyes were gone. He couldn't explain it, but he knew he hadn't imagined it. Something was out there, and it wasn't the first time he had seen those eyes. They had appeared every night since then, always watching from the edge of the dark. The next day, Adam set out to investigate. He combed the island, searching for anything that could explain the strange occurrences. He checked the lighthouse's foundation, hoping to find some sign of damage or shifting, but the stone walls were solid, unyielding. The weathered path around the island was clear, with no sign of anyone or anything lurking nearby. But then, as he walked toward the cliffs, he saw it. A strange, twisted tree, half dead, growing out of the ground at an odd angle. Its roots stretched deep into the earth, and something about it made Adam uneasy, as if it were unnatural. His eyes were drawn to a small patch of earth nearby where the ground was disturbed, as though something had been buried there long ago. His curiosity got the better of him, and Adam dug. His shovel struck something hard, and he uncovered a rotting piece of wood, old, discolored, and warped by time. He pulled it free, his hands trembling, and as he did, a foul smell filled the air, thick and rancid. Beneath the wood, there was a human skull, its eyes empty, staring up at the sky. The realization hit him like a cold wave. The island wasn't just a place where people had disappeared, it was the reason they had disappeared. The earth itself was built on the bones of the lost, a graveyard that stretched beneath the surface, feeding on the souls of those who had come before. The island had a hunger, an insatiable, endless need to consume, and it wasn't just the land that craved it. It was the eyes in the dark. As the days passed, the glowing eyes grew bolder. They began to appear closer to the cabin, always watching, always waiting. At night, Adam could hear whispers on the wind, soft murmurs that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the very foundation of the island. He could feel the island's presence like a living, breathing thing, drawing him in, consuming him with every step he took. The eyes weren't just the souls of the lost, he realized. They were trapped, caught in a cycle of suffering, forced to watch over the island, to wait for new victims to wander too close, to fall into its grasp. And the more time Adam spent on the island, the more he felt himself slipping into that same trap. The island was calling to him, feeding off his fear, his loneliness, his desperation. One night, after the eyes had returned, Adam couldn't take it anymore. He stood at the edge of the cliffs, staring out at the dark water below, feeling the pull of the island beneath his feet. The whispers had become louder, more insistent, and the eyes had grown closer, just beyond the trees, watching. He had tried to leave before, but every time he attempted to cross the island, the path twisted and changed, leading him back to the same spot, to the same waiting eyes. The island would not let him go. It had taken the others, and now it was going to take him. With one final, desperate cry, Adam threw himself toward the edge, his arms outstretched, hoping for freedom. But as he fell, he saw them, those glowing eyes staring up at him from the depths of the sea. The island had claimed him, just as it had claimed all those before him. And now, his eyes would join the others, forever trapped in the darkness, forever watching, forever feeding the island's endless hunger. Story number 7. The Last Island. The team arrived at the island in the early hours of the morning, the first light of day breaking over the horizon. The sea was calm, the air thick with humidity, and the dense jungle loomed ahead like something out of a dream. Dr. Eva Marshall, the lead biologist, gazed at the island from the deck of the research vessel. She had read all the reports, studied the satellite images, and heard the rumors. But nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to encounter. "This is it," she said, glancing at her team, a group of scientists and researchers from various fields. The last island. They were here to study the island's unique biodiversity. The location was known to be isolated, off the maps of most commercial shipping routes, and largely untouched by human hands. Over the years, strange reports had emerged, but nothing concrete. Eva had always been fascinated by the island's oddities, and now she and her team had the chance to explore it firsthand. As they made their way to shore, Eva couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The island was too quiet. Even the air felt unnaturally still. No birds, no insects, just the sound of their footsteps crunching in the dry sand. "We'll need to collect soil and water samples, get a sense of the ecosystem first," said Dr. Victor Harris, the team's ecologist. He was already setting up equipment, but his usual enthusiasm was tempered by an uneasy glance at the dense trees that surrounded them. They made camp at the edge of the jungle, setting up their tents under the oppressive canopy. As the day wore on, the unsettling silence grew, and Eva couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every movement in the jungle seemed exaggerated, every rustle of leaves too deliberate, every shadow too heavy. By evening, things took a turn for the worse. It started with the animals, or, rather, the lack of them. Eva had been expecting the sounds of tropical creatures, birds calling, insects buzzing, but all that filled the air was a heavy, unnatural quiet. It wasn't normal, it wasn't right. That night, as they gathered around the fire, they heard something. A low, guttural growl from deep within the jungle. It sent a ripple of fear through the group, but Eva dismissed it as some large animal. She told herself they were just in unfamiliar territory, but the others weren't so sure. The next morning, things only grew stranger. The team set out to explore deeper into the island, making their way through thick foliage and uneven ground. They stumbled upon strange plant life, vibrant colors that seemed almost too bright, foliage that curled unnaturally, like tendrils reaching for them. It was then that they encountered their first creature. At first, it appeared to be a giant lizard, but its scales shimmered with an unnatural sheen, reflecting the sunlight in odd patterns. Its eyes, though, were the most unsettling part. They glowed faintly in the shade, an eerie yellow that seemed to follow them as they approached. The creature was unlike anything they had ever seen. Its movements too precise, too calculated, as if it were not just an animal, but something else. "We need to get out of here," Victor said, his voice tight with fear. "This isn't right." Eva nodded, but as they turned to head back, the jungle seemed to shift. The landscape around them had changed. The path they had walked on no longer existed. What had been a clear, open trail was now a tangled mess of vines and branches. The trees seemed to have moved, as if the island itself were alive, shifting, changing. As they struggled to find their way back, the team began to uncover the island's dark history. Hidden in the undergrowth, they found remnants of old, rusted equipment, pieces of what looked like laboratories, broken glass, half-buried vials, and faded papers covered in strange symbols and equations. The horror of it all began to dawn on them. The island had once been the site of an illegal experiment, a twisted attempt at genetic engineering. Scientists had tried to create new life forms, hybrid creatures, but the experiments had gone horribly wrong. The creatures they had encountered were not natural. They were the result of these failed experiments, the island's grotesque legacy. And the island itself, it was no mere landmass. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear. The island was a living organism, a massive, breathing entity. The mutated creatures were not just products of the experiments. They were part of the island, extensions of its will. and it had been feeding off the scientists who had come here, trapping them, consuming them over the years. Panic set in as the team realized the full extent of their situation. They weren't just studying an island, they were being hunted by it. The island was aware of them, watching them, adapting to their every move. The creatures were its eyes, its arms, its will. Desperate to escape, Eva and her team raced back to the coast, but the island had other plans. The path they had walked earlier was gone. The jungle had twisted and changed, as if mocking their attempts to leave. They could feel it now, the island's hunger, its endless thirst for more victims. By the time they reached the shore, the boat they had arrived on was nowhere to be found. The ocean stretched out before them, calm and empty, a barrier they could not cross. There was no escape. The island had claimed them. Eva was the last one standing. She could feel the island closing in around her, the shadows creeping in from every side. The creatures were drawing near, their glowing eyes burning through the darkness. The island had fed on their fear, their desperation, and now it was feeding on her. In the end, there was nothing left but silence. The island was once again empty, waiting for the next team of unknowing scientists to set foot on its cursed shores. The last island would never be forgotten. Story number 8. The Island of Mirrors. The island was supposed to be a quiet, untouched paradise. For years, it had remained off the radar of modern civilization, untouched by the hand of man, hidden in the farthest corner of the Pacific. The map had shown nothing of interest, just a small speck of land, uninhabited, forgotten. Perfect for the group of explorers led by Dr. Mark Bennett, who sought only the thrill of discovery. Mark and his team, Sarah, a historian, Tom, a geologist, and Emily, a photographer, arrived on the island early in the morning. The air was thick with humidity, and the dense jungle swallowed up the coastline, hiding whatever secrets it might hold. The first day was spent scouting, taking samples, and mapping out their surroundings. It was peaceful, almost idyllic, until they stumbled upon the ruins. The ancient temple lay in a clearing, hidden beneath vines and trees. It was unlike anything they had expected. The structure was made of smooth, dark stone, weathered by time, but still standing tall, as if it had been waiting for them. The temple was simple on the outside, but as they ventured inside, they found a vast hall, its walls lined with mirrors, dozens of them, stretching from floor to ceiling. "These mirrors, they're different," Sarah whispered as she ran her fingers along one of the frames. The surface was unnaturally smooth, gleaming in the dim light. But it wasn't just the mirrors themselves that made her uneasy. It was what they reflected. At first, the reflections were what you'd expect. The team's own faces stared back at them. No distortion, no oddities. But as they ventured deeper into the temple, they began to notice something wrong. Each mirror reflected a slightly different version of the room. The shadows seemed too dark in one, the angles too sharp in another. The air felt heavier in one mirror, lighter in another. But it was when they reached the far end of the hall that the true horror began. Mark approached the largest mirror in the center of the room, its surface impossibly clean and polished. As he stared into it, his reflection didn't quite match his movements. He waved his hand, but the reflection seemed to lag, as if it wasn't in sync with his own body. His heart skipped a beat. "Did anyone else see that?" he asked, his voice trembling. The others turned, eyeing the mirror warily. Emily stepped forward, raising her camera to take a photo, but as she looked into the reflection, her own face twisted, contorting into a grotesque, snarling version of herself. She recoiled, gasping. "What is this?" The mirrors weren't just reflecting the present. They were showing something else, something wrong. Sarah leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat as she saw a version of the room where the walls were covered in blood, the floor cracked and broken. The reflections didn't just distort the room, they changed it, made it darker, more twisted, as though each mirror pulled them into a different reality. Emily reached for one of the mirrors. Her fingers brushed against the surface, and for a moment, everything went black. A chill ran down her spine, and when the world returned, she wasn't standing in the temple anymore. The air was thick, oppressive. The walls around her seemed to pulse, alive with some unseen force. Her heart raced as she spun around to find herself in another version of the temple, a darker, twisted version. "Emily?" Mark's voice broke through the fog of her panic, and she turned to see him standing at the edge of the new reality. "Are you okay?" But he wasn't really there. He was a reflection, half-formed in the murky glass of another mirror that had replaced the one she'd touched. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Get out of here," he shouted, but the words were muffled, distorted, as if coming from far away. "Emily!" Tom called, his voice frantic. He was standing in another distorted mirror, his figure flickering like a candle flame. His face was twisted, as though caught in an eternal scream. "We have to get out!" Sarah screamed, her voice cracking as she backed away from the mirrors. But it was too late. The mirrors weren't just showing them alternate realities. They were pulling them into them, trapping them in a labyrinth of shifting worlds. One by one, the team members were pulled into different versions of the temple, each more twisted and dangerous than the last. One room was filled with choking black smoke. Another was frozen in time, the figures in the mirrors forever frozen mid-motion. There were versions of the room where the temple's walls dripped with blood, where the floor was littered with the bones of the forgotten. But each time they tried to escape, the mirrors shifted, and they were trapped in another reality, another nightmare. Mark ran, desperate to find a way out, but the temple seemed endless, the mirrors multiplying with every turn. Every hallway led to another reflection, another version of the island, each darker, more corrupted. He could feel the weight of the mirrors pressing in on him, each one showing something worse, each one reaching out for him, pulling him closer to whatever horror the island held in its core. And then he saw it, the final reflection, at the center of the temple. A mirror that didn't show him at all. Instead, it showed the island itself, a barren, desolate place, covered in dark fog, with a blackened sky overhead. In the reflection, the island was alive, its surface shifting like the skin of some monstrous creature, its very foundation built on the bodies of those who had come before. Mark reached for the mirror, his fingers brushing against the surface. The world around him shuddered, and he was pulled into it, into the final, twisted version of the island, a place where nothing was real, where the reflections ruled, and where there was no way out. The last thing he saw was his own face, staring back at him from the mirror, twisted and broken, lost forever in the labyrinth of mirrors. The island had claimed them all, and now it would never let them go. Story number 9. The Crying Island Dr. Oliver Hayes had always been fascinated by ecosystems. As a researcher, his work had taken him to many remote corners of the world, but none of them had intrigued him quite like this island. It was isolated, almost forgotten by time, and yet its biodiversity was remarkable. Strange plants, unusual creatures, and an untouched landscape that seemed to have a life of its own. It was a perfect subject for study, and Oliver had arrived with a sense of excitement, eager to dive into his work. The first few days were filled with the usual routine. He collected samples, cataloged species, and documented his findings. The island was beautiful in its own way, a place of quiet, untouched, natural wonder. But each night as the sun set and the temperature dropped, something strange would happen. It started with faint sounds, soft, almost indistinguishable at first. The cries, the sound of someone calling out in distress, would drift across the shore on the night breeze. At first, Oliver thought it was just his imagination, the wind playing tricks on him, or perhaps the calls of some nocturnal animal. But as the nights went on, the cries grew louder, more distinct, and impossible to ignore. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the sound would echo in his mind, and he found himself walking to the shore, searching for the source. But no matter how far he ventured, no one was ever there. The cries seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the air, tugging at his senses, driving him to the brink of madness. It was on the fourth night that Oliver decided he couldn't ignore it any longer. He grabbed his flashlight, pulling on his boots, and made his way down to the beach. The night was thick with fog, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light across the water. The cries were louder now, unmistakable. They were human, filled with sorrow and desperation. He followed the sound, his heart pounding, until he reached a secluded cove on the far side of the island. The cries seemed to be coming from the rocks, but as he searched, there was nothing. No person, no animal, nothing that could explain the source. He stepped closer, his flashlight casting shadows on the jagged rocks, and then he saw it. A small opening in the cliffside, hidden behind vines and moss. His curiosity got the better of him, and he crawled through, his heart racing. Inside, the air was colder, the walls damp with salt. He stepped carefully, listening to the cries that now seemed to vibrate in the stone itself. They were no longer distant, but right beside him, as if the walls themselves were weeping. The further he ventured into the cavern, the heavier the air became. It pressed down on him, thick and suffocating, and with every step the cries grew louder. He felt a chill run down his spine, but he couldn't stop. He had to know what was causing this, what was driving him to madness. That's when he found them, the bones. Scattered across the floor of the cave, remnants of long-forgotten souls, their hollow eyes staring out from the darkness. Some were clothed in tattered rags, others were mere skeletons, their bones picked clean. But all had one thing in common. Their mouths were open, frozen in eternal screams, their cries captured forever in the stillness of the cave. Oliver staggered back, a wave of nausea hitting him. The cries were not just sounds. They were the echoes of the souls trapped here, victims of the island's curse. The island wasn't just a place of isolation, it was alive, a living entity that fed on pain and suffering. It had been feeding on the souls of those who had tried to escape, those who had sought freedom only to be pulled back into its grasp. The cries were the voices of the lost, doomed to wander the island for eternity, never allowed to leave. The realization hit him like a punch. The island wasn't just an ecosystem, it was a trap, a prison created by some ancient, malevolent force. Something that had made the island its home, drawing in anyone who ventured too close, consuming their souls in exchange for its twisted, endless existence. As the night wore on, Oliver could feel the island's presence, watching him, waiting. The cries grew louder, more insistent, as though the spirits knew what was coming, knew that he was next. He tried to run, to leave, but the path back to the shore was gone. The cave had changed. The walls shifted, the rocks rearranged, and the island had swallowed him whole. He wasn't just lost in the cave, he was lost in time. The island had a power over him, an insidious grip that tightened around his heart. The cries were no longer just echoes, they were voices inside his head, whispering, taunting. pulling him deeper into the island's embrace. He could feel the weight of their suffering, the burden of their eternal torment. Oliver understood now. He wasn't just trapped on the island. He was becoming part of it. His pain, his fear, were feeding the entity that controlled the island, just like the others before him. He could feel it creeping into his mind, twisting his thoughts, filling him with the same sorrow and desperation that had claimed the souls of the island's victims. The last thing he saw before the darkness overtook him was the shore, the same one he had arrived on. But now it was not the shore he had known. The cries filled the air, louder than ever, the voices of the lost souls calling out to him, pulling him down into the abyss. The crying island would claim him, just as it had claimed all those before him. And now, his voice would join the others, lost in the eternal torment, forever trapped by the island's cursed will. Story number 10. The Island Beneath the Sea. It was supposed to be an exciting expedition, a chance to explore a previously uncharted island, a place that had appeared on no maps, buried deep in the ocean. Dr. Rachel Bennett, an experienced marine biologist, was leading the team. She had heard whispers of this island from old sailors' tales, but no one had dared venture close enough to confirm its existence. The coordinates were vague, but they were enough to set off on an adventure. She gathered her team: Adam, a geologist, Luis, a navigator, and Sarah, a photographer, and they set sail. For days, the sea was calm, almost unnervingly so. There was something about the water here, the way it shimmered unnaturally, that unsettled them all. But they brushed it off. They were close now, the island's silhouette barely visible on the horizon, a dark shape looming like a secret waiting to be uncovered. When they arrived, there was no land to step onto. The island, as they soon learned, wasn't above the sea, it was beneath it. They found a submerged cavern just off the coast, its mouth wide and open, as if inviting them in. Rachel's heart raced with a mix of excitement and dread as they prepared to dive. The idea of exploring an underwater cavern had always fascinated her. But as they descended into the water, something about the place didn't feel right. The water was thick, almost viscous, and the deeper they went, the darker it became, until the light from their headlamps was swallowed whole. The cavern was vast, an eerie silence filling the space as they swam deeper. There were stalactites and stalagmites that had formed over centuries, the jagged edges like the teeth of some ancient beast. But then they saw it. The island, or what was left of it. It wasn't a typical landmass. It was a grotesque, submerged structure, like the ruins of a long-forgotten civilization, half buried underwater, but still strangely intact. As they explored the cavern's mouth, they saw the remnants of ancient walls, carvings on the stone, and large pillars supporting the structure. But there was no light, nothing to indicate life. It was like a tomb, a place that had been sealed away for a reason. And then they found them. The creatures. At first, they thought they were seeing things, shadows darting in the periphery of their vision. But as they moved deeper, the shadows took form. Grotesque, twisted creatures, their bodies long and sinewy, adapted for the dark waters they inhabited. Their skin was pale, translucent, slick like fish, but their eyes, wide, dark, and hollow, were all too human. And when they saw the explorers, the creatures didn't flee. Instead, they moved closer, watching them with an unsettling curiosity. The team froze, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Some of the creatures seemed almost human, though their bodies had been altered by the darkness they had lived in for eons. Others were more monstrous, with tendrils that slithered and jagged, clawed limbs. They were trapped in the cavern, imprisoned by the very island itself, their forms warped by time and isolation. The deeper they ventured, the more they realized that the island wasn't a natural formation. It was a prison, built long ago to hold these creatures, to keep them from escaping. The island, it seemed, had been constructed to keep something terrible locked away. But what was it? And why had it been hidden beneath the sea? As they moved through the cavern, the answers became more terrifying. The walls were lined with inscriptions, symbols that seemed to pulse with an ancient, malevolent energy. They described the creatures, how they were once human, twisted by some unfathomable force that had made them into these horrors. The deeper they read, the more they understood. The island was not a sanctuary. It was a prison, created by an ancient civilization to hold these creatures in the depths of the sea, where they could never escape. And then they felt it. The ground beneath them began to tremble, a low rumble that reverberated through the water. The island was sinking, slowly but surely, collapsing back into the abyss. The creatures, sensing their chance for freedom, began to stir, their once sluggish movements now more urgent. The air, thick with tension, felt suffocating, and the team realized, with a growing sense of horror, that they were not the only ones trapped here. The island was alive, and it was beginning to die. "We need to leave," Rachel said, her voice cracking with panic. "We need to go, now." But it was too late. The water around them began to shift violently, and the creatures moved toward them, their eyes wide with desperation. They were no longer just passive observers. They were hunting. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as the team scrambled to swim back toward the surface. The cavern had become a maze of shifting rock and water, the walls collapsing as the island slowly sank deeper into the sea. The creatures were following, their distorted shapes gliding through the water, their eyes glowing with a hunger that sent a cold chill through her veins. Sarah, her breath ragged, was the first to break the surface, gasping for air. But as Rachel surfaced behind her, she saw that the creatures were still coming, their long limbs reaching for the light, drawn by the scent of human blood. The island was sinking, taking everything with it: their escape, the creatures, and the dark history of the place. It was a tomb, and they had unwittingly unlocked it. As the team struggled to stay afloat, the island, in its death throes, pulled them back into the water, where it would claim them, just as it had claimed all those who had tried to escape before them. And deep below, in the drowned caverns of the island, the creatures would wait. They would wait for the next explorers, the next victims to stumble upon the island that wasn't above the sea, but beneath it. A place where nightmares were born and souls were forever trapped.